on there back in 1910 by Falk. Here's another one of these pottery vessels. We call these things Boone cord marked and Boone plainware because there's so many of them been found in Boone County, Missouri. Here's an example of another one of these vessels. They were actually not burying people with pottery, they were burying people with food. And today, modern archaeologists would have been very concerned to look at the soil and the interior of these pottery vessels for possible clues as to what kind of a recipe the containers might have contained. They were not corn. This is before corn entered the major part of the diet in this part of the Missouri River Valley. It's possibly a gruel made out of hickory nuts and pecans, something that grow in Boone County in abundance. It may have been some form of meat stew, we will never know for sure, that was buried inside these pottery vessels. As I was working with the collections at the Missouri Historical Society and at the Smithsonian, I was surprised to see many stone tools. None of these had been illustrated in Falk's original report, though he made passing comments to them. And indeed, some of these stone tools predate the time period of the mounds, suggesting that either they had been picked up by these people and used, reused later, or that there may have been earlier burials on the same ridgetop that had been then covered by the later mounds. Most of the artifacts that are diagnostic, stone tool artifacts that are diagnostic, are what are called rice side notch points, a form of artifact that would be named by Dr. Carl Chapman by work he did in the 1960s at Table Rock Reservoir. Most of them were manufactured out of the local church in Boone County that had been heat treated. We would date them to around 400 to 900 AD. In fact, this style of artifact, while you cannot directly radiocarbon date it, charcoal associated with the style of artifact dates out around AD 740 plus or minus 50, a process that Falk wished he would have had, radiocarbon dating, in 1906, 1907. Another example of a rice side notch. This last year on my birthday, we decided to have the official Falk lookalike contest. And here you can see myself and Professor Ralph Roulette deciding to retrace Falk's exploration of the bluffs of the Missouri River. We actually went out and relocated the Dawson Mound Group area. Professor Nethery Fuller decided not to compete in the Falk lookalike contest, but stayed back in the car with a cell phone so she could call the sheriff if either of us had medical crises, which we both did. Yes, well, we made it back alive. There is a photograph that Ralph took of me with one of the two surviving Dawson Mounds located along the bluff, still surviving in Boone County. And here's a photograph I took of Ralph measuring one of the limestone slabs that had been used in the framing of these, if you would, interior stone structures. By the way, Falk in his excavations kept on finding these elbow-type pipes, which we now associate with the late Woodland period. And here's one from the nearby Easley Mounds that he had excavated. I have to give Falk credit for the fact that he created so much interest in these mounds in Boone County that after his death there would be a follow-up project conducted by Carl Chapman, Professor Jesse Rich, and James L. Lowe. And there they are in their pit helmets in 1938, where they revisited several of Falk's sites, decided not to re-excavate sites he had done himself, but to turn to sites nearby. By 1930s, by the way, excavation methodologies had changed. No longer did you drive a stake in the center of a mound and measure from the stake in the different cardinal directions, but you set up a grid of stakes on the mound, and then you carefully mapped the mound, something that Falk did not do. And you also did profile drawings of what the interiors of the mounds looked like and how the stones were stacked up. Certainly archaeological methodologies change and evolve from one generation to the next, and I'm sure that future archaeologists will not dig the way that I am digging today. It's interesting that among these mounds, the most recently excavated Boone County mound was dug in 1989 by Gary Rex Walters, a mound nearby where Falk had worked called the West Haven Mound. Originally, 3 mounds had stood at the West Haven site. A local developer building condos bulldozed 2 of the mounds off the side of the cliff, and finally, archaeologists were able to rush and beg to have a single day to excavate the surviving West Haven mound. And what you can see is that Gary Rex Walter found a number of fairly poorly preserved skeletons, described very similar to those that Falk had found. But in his excavation methodology, he was able to prove there were 19 individuals buried in the one mound that he was able to dig called the West Haven Mound. And ironically, out of all those burials, there was only a single artifact placed with West Haven, And that was, again, one of these elbow pipes, a type of pipe that Falk had first discovered in the 1906-1907 field work. Falk's second major contribution to Missouri archaeology came from going to a site called the Oudts site, 23SA2, 23 the state of Missouri, SA Saline County, to the second site there, where he worked for a couple of weeks at a site that was the contact village site for the Missouri Indian tribe, a site that had extremely deep storage pits that the Missouri Indians had excavated and then converted those pits eventually into trash pits. Here's a photograph taken of a University of Missouri Columbia student in the 1970s excavating in the same area of the Oudts village site that Falk had excavated in and finding one of these storage pits with cook pots and bison scapula in the upper soil. Falk was the first person to publish an undamaged, intact Missouri Indian pottery vessel, here a cook pot from the Oudts site, a pottery form that today we call Oudts trailed ware, belonging to a culture called the Oneota culture. Here's a drawing from the 1940s by Professor Carl Chapman, actually by his wife Eleanor Chapman, a husband and wife archaeology team, of one of the vessels that the Chapmans had excavated. And when I was at the Smithsonian, I managed to photograph and catalog hundreds of Oudts pottery sherds that Falk showed and excavated in 1906, 1907. Do you want to look at all of them? Well, they're not all there, but it was quite interesting to look at these because he was excavating and recording the site before lots of these had been damaged by cultivation, by illicit excavations, and other issues. In Falk's excavation in 1906-07 at the site of Oudts, he found several burials, and he noted that some of the burials were inside houses, and indeed this would be confirmed by the subsequent excavations by Professor Chapman and Professor Robert Bray. What's interesting is that in the Chapman and Bray excavations, their methodology allowed them to detect the faint patterns of post molds, and they could actually see the houses, something that Falk had missed in his excavation. We can actually do estimations on how many people lived in a house, something Falk did not have an advantage of. Narrow's constant, for example, suggests that house number 1 had 9 individuals. It was full of historic period artifacts. House number 3, which is highlighted in blue here, by its size would have had 8 individuals living in it. And my colleague Nethery Fuller is convinced that this must have represented an evolution of a polygamous family structure from the earlier house structures at the Oudts site, which are much smaller. Before the historic contact period, only 3 people or 4 people lived in houses, nuclear families, which would expand into polygamous families with the contact period. Falk was able to determine that indeed this was a historic Indian tribe village site because there were artifacts found in there, including, for example, rings that Jesuit priests had given to some of the Indians. And indeed, these are some of the types of metal artifacts, rings, and hair curls that were found in excavations at the site. At the same time, the site's roots extended into the prehistoric period, and here are some Missouri Indian arrow points that come from the Oudts site, as well as a drawing of one of its style of Catlinite pipes. The work at the site at Oudts has recovered several artifacts out of the red stone called Catlinite, the most famous being this piece of Catlinite with the image of some kind of a bird, probably a woodpecker form, and then evidence of Indian maces overlaying its face. The third most important contribution by Falk in terms of Missouri archaeology was his mapping of a site called the Old Fort Site, 23SA104, a site that is now protected as the Oudts site is protected by Van Meter State Park. It's very interesting that this site was re-examined by University of Missouri Columbia professor Raymond Wood in the 1970s because he wanted to re-excavate a portion of the site that Falk had not tested to determine what the time period and the age of the site was. What Ray Wood was able to discover was that the large artifact on the left-hand side belonged to the Middle Woodland period, roughly 2,000 years ago, but that most of the digging of the old fort walls had belonged to the same time period as the Oudts village, the time period of the Missouri Indian tribe. And in fact, it was very interesting that he could confirm many of the same observations that Falk had posted. But then at the same time, Ray Wood had new methodologies and new techniques. He was able to discover that the soil where all these artifacts was found was laden with tobacco seeds. And apparently the old fort had been a tobacco garden used by the Oneota tribe. Falk would reorganize the archaeological displays at the Missouri Historical Society. He would return to excavating the Ozarks in the 1910s and the 1920s. He would die at the age of 78 from influenza. According to his obituary, it was only the second time in his life he'd ever been sick. But I must confess to you that reading his letters indicate that he had suffered badly from knee and hip problems from having done so much excavation in a life. He published many reports, including a report catalog of some of the artifacts in the Missouri Historical Society. You know what? I've had a chance to give you only a glimmer of a very important archaeological project that was supported by the St. Louis Society of the Archaeological Institute of America that Falk thanked in his report, which was published in 1910 by the Smithsonian Institution. There are a number of my colleagues I must thank. There are a number of institutions I must thank. But in the final word, there's one person I must thank above all, and that is Gerard Falk. Thank you.